Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
Thank you very much for that, and thanks for coming. I'm only going to speak for between 20 and at most 30 minutes now. I'll try and keep it towards the 20 end of that. The reason for the title, about whether we're on a turn, is that I was writing another book. And I've got into a bit of a repetition now. I tend to write books about the same kind of thing again and again and again. And what you do when you write one of these books is you look up the latest statistics so that you can say just how bad everything has become and how it's getting worse and worse and worse, and you can complain about it. My problem is, as I will show you in a few minutes, when I did this at the worldwide level for inequality, I couldn't find the evidence to say it is getting worse in most places. So there is a possibility that we may now be at a point of change. And if we are, we should at least recognise that. It doesn't mean everything's going to get fine, it doesn't mean it's all going to be great. The last time globally the world was unequal as it is today, in fact slightly more unequal at the maxima, was almost exactly 100 years ago, when Halford Mackinder was around. I think he was actually taking troops into Russia to quell a revolution, which was one of his many failures in life that he didn't manage to do. But just because inequality hit a turn worldwide 100 years ago, didn't mean that the next 10 or 20 or even 30 years would have much fun. We had a Second World War, we had a Great Depression, many things went wrong, even though inequality was falling in the 1920s and 1930s. I can say a little bit about the UK. I can't say very much about Newcastle, but I did put it in the title. I should say you did have an Inequality Commission a few years ago. You may wonder what did that Inequality Commission do, but it highlighted inequalities in the city, it highlighted who was the best paid, it put some pressure on, and my suspicion is that those who were best paid in Newcastle a few years ago haven't seen their pay increase. Pay at the bottom has actually increased because the minimum wage has gone up, more people have adopted the living wage. So you may actually have seen a reduction in inequalities in Newcastle up to now, partly because the worst of the benefit cuts are yet to come. But the problem is on the left we are constantly going and it's not good and there's always something terrible. We don't tend to celebrate when things do get better. When it comes to the United Kingdom, before I get on to the rest of the world, you'll sometimes hear that inequalities peaked in 1990. And they did peak in 1990 between the worst off fifth and the best off fifth of the population. But that was of no use to anybody, because at the same time as that peak was reached in 1990, the 1% began to take more and more and more each year. And so the fact that inequalities were falling for most people since the 1990s didn't make everybody feel better, because a small group were taking this very large share, and then the largest share of the 1% anywhere in Europe. But that peaked around about 2012. We don't yet know if the peak of the take of the 1% was due to them actually taking less money, or if they began to hide their money really well in 2013 and 2014 and 2015. But if the 1% have become worried about tax inspectors to a point where they are hiding their money better than they were before, even that is good news. When inequalities begin to fall, they fall at the bottom first, and then the incomes at the bottom of the 1% begin to fall, but the Sunday Times rich list carry on doing well, and eventually the Sunday Times rich list folk don't do well. We're not yet there. Let me tell you about the worldwide data, to try to give you a reason to think that there might be something in this. We only started collecting inequality data about income inequality in the world about 15 to 20 years ago. The United Nations Development Programme publishes it every year in a Human Development Report. And the first figures that I saw came from 2004. So recently I took the most recent figures that the UNDP published and compared them to those 2004 figures. And I'm going to start with the richest countries in the world, the 20 richest countries that are large in the world, and I'll start with the most unequal. The most unequal is currently Israel. The best off fifth of people in Israel receive before tax about 10 times more than the poorest fifth in Israel. You can probably see why Israel is this unequal. Inequality has been increasing in Israel in recent years. It's not a good news story. It's often on your news because it's not a good news story. The second most unequal country in the world is the United States, in the rich world. The best off fifth in the United States get 10 times more before tax than the poorest fifth. And that inequality has risen in the last decade. The best off fifth have taken the entire annual income of the poorest fifth in terms of their extra take in the last 10 years. And that's mainly just people in the 1% who've actually taken most of that. The third most unequal country in the rich world is the United Kingdom. And inequalities in the United Kingdom have risen since 2004. At this point you may be thinking, why am I saying that it's turned? But we'll get there. The problem is that if you look at Israel, if you look at the USA, and if you look at the UK, you're looking at a miserable failure when it comes to inequality. You're looking at pitiful places that cannot get their act together and treat other human beings within their own society like scum. But these places are not typical. It is just very hard to see that if you spent all of your life living in one of them. Right? But if you want to be optimistic about things, you need to widen your geographical horizons and look outwards somewhere. The next three places in terms of the most unequal in the rich world are now Spain, Italy and Greece. And you'll see they have something in common in the last few years. And they've all seen very small increases in inequality. So things have not been getting better in Spain, Italy and Greece. But we won't go into that any further. Just to say, they're not doing as bad as the UK, the USA and Israel. I don't fix these things. They come out in these kind of neat patterns. It was interesting that when Theresa May became Prime Minister, the first two world leaders I think she met was the head of Israel and the head of the USA. Next is Australia. But in Australia, income inequalities have fallen in the last 10 years. The best off fifth now have the entire income of the poorest fifth less. Not because they've got poorer, but because most of the gains in Australia have been amongst the poorest fifth, if you believe the UNDP figures. The next most unequal country is Canada. And nothing's changed in Canada. It hasn't got worse, it hasn't got better, it's got Justin Trudeau, which if you're in North America, now looks wonderful because of what's happening south of the Canadian border. Next is Japan, very equal country but becoming a bit more unequal. They think it's terrible in Japan but they do not know what inequality is in Japan. Then we have Ireland. Inequality has actually fallen in Ireland. The best off lost out more than the poorest in Ireland with the economic crash. Partly because there's now a land value tax in Ireland, which you only pay if you've got property, and it's progressive. If you own a property worth more than €1 million, you actually have to pay a higher proportion of your wealth. Next is Switzerland, and inequalities in Switzerland have fallen. Then there's France, and inequalities in France have fallen. Then Belgium, they've risen slightly. Germany's risen slightly. Austria, they've fallen. Netherlands, they've fallen dramatically. And if you begin to wonder or look for patterns in these things, you think, what might people do in the Netherlands if they're becoming more equal? They already were very equal, but they're becoming more equal in the last 10 or 15 years. Might they just not behave in the same way as people in the UK and the USA have behaved? Just think back to that election just a few days ago. And then Denmark, inequality falling, then Norway, Sweden, Finland, either static or falling. Of the 20 richest countries with a large population on the planet, 8 of them have falling inequality, 3 have low and hardly any risings, 1, Canada, is static, and only 8 have seen rises. It's early to say that this is not the kind of damning picture of inequality is rising everywhere that we saw about 10 or 15 years ago. What about the poorest countries of the world? And this is all based on household surveys. The household surveys are particularly unreliable in the poorest countries of the world, but they are all we have. The other thing that's going on in the poorest countries of the world is that people are still coming off the land, coming off living off a subsistence income where they may have recorded no income at all. So these are the least reliable figures we're ever going to get, but they're the only ones we get. If you look at the poorest countries according to UNDP, this is what you get. Inequality in Pakistan falling in Niger, falling in Burundi, falling in Nepal, falling in Mali, rising slightly in Ethiopia, falling in Guinea, falling in Sierra Leone, rising or static in Yemen, falling in Guinea-Bissau, falling in Tanzania, falling in Burkina Faso, falling in Madagascar, falling in Cameroon, falling in Nigeria. I could carry on, but basically we're seeing falls in inequalities within most of the poorest countries on the planet. And between countries, since 1999, we've seen falling income inequalities because, and particularly with the global economic crash in 2008, the GDP of North America, the GDP of all of Europe, and the GDP of Japan has come down from being on average about 3.5 times old average GDP to about 1. It's the biggest fall in 200 years, the first fall relative to the world average income, the first fall where all 3 of the richer parts of the world have seen their relative incomes fall. We've got global income inequality convergence. Nobody celebrates it because we've got it because of an almighty, giant global recession affecting the richest countries on the planet. And we're in Newcastle, and it doesn't feel good. And we're ruled by a government who's decided to make poorer places in the north pay far more than places in the south. But the UK is just a small part of this. This is a global pattern. I've got 5 minutes to go. Just some more of this kind of news that gets missed. Top executives in the United States, chief executive officers of the Fortune 500 companies, by the top companies in the US. What's happened to their pay most recently? In 2014, they were paid on average 373 times the average worker. 373. So in one day, they received more pay than the average worker receives in a year. The average top 500 executives in the USA. A year later, by 2015, that had dropped to 335 times. Nobody celebrated. That's really good. It's really good that nobody celebrated. I didn't find a single news story that said this was a wonderful thing. The news stories either said it's still far too high, or on the far right wing, they said this is terrible, these wealth creators won't create as much wealth if we don't pay them more. But there are less and less of those kind of stories over time. The average income of those 500 men, they're almost all men, but there's more of them called Dave and John than there are women. The average income in 1 year of the Daves and Johns fell from $13.5 million to $12.4. Fell by $1.1 million on average each one. And again, no celebration. The average worker in the US saw their wages go up $900, just $900 to $36,900. The reason we don't celebrate is that in 1990 this ratio, rather than being 335 to 1, was 42 to 1. In 1990 it was 107 to 1. We've got a long, long way to go to get back to 1980s, let alone the 70s, the 60s or the 50s. But it's a reduction and it's not being noticed. My last one for you, just the beginnings of evidence for this, is the world's billionaires. Now there's this pattern, or maybe a pattern, I could be imagining this pattern, but as the inequalities begin to turn, it's people beneath the top who begin to lose out. And now in Britain we're seeing people within the 1%, but not in the top half of the 1%, not doing so well. And worldwide we're seeing billionaires who are not in the top half of billionaires, not doing so well. Now you may not worry about the fortunes of billionaires, but it's a group, it's kind of the Donald Trump level group. Donald Trump is one of these people who nobody's quite sure exactly what his wealth is. That's why he won't release his tax return, apart from the one favourable year that he leaked, because he doesn't want you to know. Donald Trump, by the way, has had 3,500 court cases against him in his life, to give you an idea about what his finances are like. Anyway, October 2016, we had 1,397 dollar billionaires in the world, according to the latest wealth survey. And in the previous 12 months, those 1,397 had on average lost $215 million. The total wealth of the world's billionaires fell from 5,400 billion to 5,100 billion in a year. But the richest billionaires still carried on getting richer. And so Oxfam could claim, slightly altering their definitions, that the richest 8 people in the world had the same wealth as the world's poorest half. And of course Oxfam don't have any incentive to tell you, once you go to the bottom half of billionaires, things aren't looking so rosy. Which is fair enough, it's not Oxfam's job to worry about the plight of lesser well-off billionaires. What's happening? History doesn't repeat. Right? We know history doesn't repeat. There's a great temptation to say history repeats. And then when you say history repeats, you look at the history of inequality, which goes up and down and up and down. Thomas Piketty is wrong. It wasn't high forever before 1913. There are cycles that you can see throughout the whole of history. But it goes up and down in different ways. When it last peaked, around about 1913, 1917, absolutely nobody knew it had peaked. And they didn't know it had peaked because nobody knew what it was, or even that there was such a thing as income inequality to worry about. A man called Hugh Dalton did his PhD thesis on it, I think in the 1920s, maybe early 1930s. And his PhD thesis concluded that there simply weren't the numbers to be able to work out what inequality was. And he became Chancellor of the Exchequer a couple of decades later. We didn't know the last time it peaked, that it was peaking. Now we really do know. And we know it's a problem. We know because Obama said, I think in 2014, that this was the worst problem in the world. The President of China in 2015 put it up as his priority. The Pope, was it 2016 when the Pope said that inequality is terrible? And the world's business leaders at Davos, who meet every year and normally come up with 30 things that they say are terrible, and they've had inequality in the top 3 for the last 5 or 6 years. This January only had one thing, and it was inequality, because they are scared. It is different now. You don't have to have a Russian Revolution to scare the rich, or a world war that means you have to tax the rich, or a crash like 1929. These things are not necessary to occur. You simply need an awareness of what's happening, and for inequality to rise at the agenda, for all the problems that are created by inequality to be seen as being due to inequality, and an increasingly well-educated and knowledgeable global population who are not willing to constantly see themselves be given a smaller and smaller share of the economic pie as we shower yet more and more qualifications on them. It is very different from the past. You cannot do that. I'm getting very near to the end. Let me just give you one last set of stats. Currently, the peaks for inequality are 2007 in Italy for the 1%, 2008 in Singapore, 2006 in Spain, 2007 in China. Inequality is now falling in China since 2007. So the countries which had peaks earlier that were higher: Denmark 1917, UK 1919, Germany 1917, Netherlands 1916, Sweden 1916. 2007-8 are looking like 1916-17 in terms of numbers. I know I'm a very sad man, and I take these numbers more seriously than I should do. But there is a great danger of thinking that globalisation is just out of control. Capitalism is out of control, the rich will carry on getting richer, there's nothing you can do about it, short of a worldwide revolution it won't get better. If it is already beginning to get better, and getting better quickly in some places like the Netherlands, which already were looking pretty good, if the Swiss can let their 1% have half as much as our 1%, and see inequality falling in Switzerland, then the idea that nothing is going to improve without an almighty calamity or some other kind of crash appears to be less serious a proposition. It is possible that things can get better. The problem is that you need them to get better and better and better and better, so you cannot celebrate the gains when you get a gain. But the great danger is you don't notice when you've had a gain. You don't notice the beginnings of it. And then you give up and you have despair. And my worry is at the moment I think we have too much despair. There are good reasons for the despair in the UK and the USA. Things are particularly bad. But if we look out at other countries, we can see that they're not all behaving the same way. We have to wait to see what the French do and then the Germans, what they do. But within a year's time from now, we could be faced with a situation where people on the mainland of Europe are looking at us with a bit of pity and trying to work out what they can do to be kind to us because of our problem. And that's not going to feel very nice. But if you just look at how much has changed within a year, within a year, within a year in the last few years, the idea that things cannot alter really should be consigned away. I'm sure you're going to ask me questions about contemporary British politics. I do on the optimistic side for these things, but particularly given that China and India have both passed the peak of inequality and inequalities appear to be falling in both countries. Even if all these things are due to the richest people in all these countries hiding their wealth and their income even better on tax haven islands, the fact that they now feel they need to hide their wealth and their income suggests that they're frightened that somebody is looking at what they're doing in a way that hasn't been looked at before. Thank you very much for letting me talk for 25 minutes. Please ask me some questions.